Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, August 23rd, and we're going to hear D-PRAT and Serving the Underserved, Lessons on Creative Partnerships. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to help you through those. For questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the Q&A box, and it would help if you list the panelist, the speaker, who you'd like to start answering the question. It just helps us speed through the Q&A process. So again, type those questions in the Q&A box. We'll get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Today, we are sponsored by the Urban Design and Preservation Division. Thanks to you, as always, for bringing us a wonderful selection of sessions, and we look forward to today. Next up on your screen, these are our September webinars that we have available and ready for you to register for. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session is worth 1.5 AICP CM credits. So if you are in need of those CM credits, you can get 1.5 today. Log into your My APA account on planning.org. And from there, you can search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website. Again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and a weekly reminder of what's on tap. We record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So just search Planning Webcast on YouTube and we'll pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you get notified when new sessions have been uploaded. This session will most likely be uploaded and ready to view on Monday. So that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you have questions for our panelists, type them in the Q&A box. We'll get to those at the end. Using the raise your hand feature isn't going to do anything. Just type those questions in the box and we'll get to them. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick things off.
Well, great. Thank you. Marianne, would you like to go ahead and share our screen? Excellent. So welcome, everyone. We are really excited to share with you a program that the Urban Design and Preservation has been doing for the last couple of years. It's really been an opportunity for our members and to get involved in just a really kind of interesting role, supporting other communities. And as I think about this, this is really an opportunity as planners to do public service. And so this is what we're going to talk about today, is this great opportunity for members. And also we have some communities that may be interested. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. First of all, my name is Chris Kreider. I am the chair-elect, soon to be the chair of the Urban Design and Preservation Division. I am an urban design supervisor and serve as the county architect in Arlington County, Virginia. And I'd like to turn things over to Marianne. Introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Marianne Stuck. I'm the D-PRAT coordinator with the division and have been on that role for the last 4+ years. And I am also an urban designer and planner in the private sector with a design workshop based out of Colorado. Crystal, which was our next panelist, she is the city administrator of the city of Milan, Missouri, which was one of the communities we work with 2 years ago. Unfortunately, she woke up feeling pretty sick this morning, and I don't think she will be able to join us. So I'm going to hand it over to Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina Viala. I am the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Pompano Beach, the former Sustainability Administrator for the City of North Miami that participated in D-PRAT. I'll hand it over.
Aaron, yeah, please, Aaron.
Hi there, Aaron Markovich, Economic and Community Development Director for the town of Enfield.
Okay, so let's get started, Marianne.
Yes, thanks. Well, good morning and afternoon, everyone, again, and thanks for being here with us today. Like Chris mentioned, we will explore the idea of creative partnerships and how we have used this very powerful tool through our technical assistance program. So to give you a high-level overview, we are all part of the Urban Design and Preservation Division, which is a nationwide community, and we are dedicated of supporting educational and networking opportunities for planners, urban designers, historic preservationists. We have some architects in our group too, and students from across the country. We are a large division with over 1,900 members. And we really do think that we are all about partnerships and bringing the different areas of expertise, the different levels of experience together to find ways to contribute to the planning profession. D-PRAT, which stands for Design and Preservation Rapid Assistance Team, is one of our volunteer-led and managed technical assistant program. We have other initiatives in the division too, but this one has certainly become one of our signature initiatives during the last year. There are many small towns and communities, and also not so small ones across the country that have limited or even non-existent access to either planning or design resources. So with this in mind, and also in an effort to give back to our communities, our division created and deployed the D-PRAT team as a fully pro bono program that is dedicated to support mostly under-resourced communities. So we have been focusing on solving problems that are related to planning, urban design, historic preservation. We have collaborated with local governments and community organizations, and Chris is going to talk more about those specific partnerships in a little bit. But it also has allowed us to create partnerships within the division, working collaboratively to address issues that range from equity to public space and street design, to looking at housing solutions, and to addressing things like climate change, adaptation, and resiliency in our cities and towns. At a high level, we seek to bring a diverse community of both experienced and emerging urban designers, planners, and preservationists into a shared conversation and learning experience. So for the last 3 years, D-PRAT has opened this path to volunteers and designers to work with communities at the nationwide level. And we have fully relied on division members that have supported this effort both in person and virtually. And everyone comes together looking and exploring solutions to various urban challenges and lend their expertise for the betterment of others. So we have a little quote there from a participant that he said that is a way that has helped him have better relationships with other division members, with other planners, and with different communities. To give you a very high level update on what the timeline of D-PRAT has been, if you're not that familiar with the program, it started with a brainstorming session at the National Planning Conference in 2019, where leaders from the division wanted to find ways to open up the division to more members, to other planners, and to communities. And so the idea struck of working with underserved communities, and especially tackle historic preservation and urban design related challenges that, like we said many times, they don't have the resources to do so. We had a year-long task force with volunteers from the division that worked to envision how this program would work and how we would deploy it. It was delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we were able to deploy the first D-PRAT team to the town of Center in Colorado in 2021. because of that whole COVID situation, we envisioned the program as a hybrid one. So we thought we would have a larger virtual team and a smaller in-person team. For center, it was only 2 volunteers on site, and you can see we only had 5 virtual volunteers. But a year later, we deployed a larger team to work with the community of Milan in Missouri. And last year, we were able to have up to 10 in-person participants to support the city of North Miami in Florida. So the program has certainly been growing, and we're very excited about that. We have kept the virtual format because we think it allows more members to participate. And we have also included a D-PRAT scholar that is a student that is just dedicated to helping us with the preparation and then the final report and everything related with the program itself. The way the program is structured is around a 2-day intensive workshop on site with in-person volunteers, during which different experts from around the country will fly or come over, and we will engage with the community, with local leadership. We will do site tours. We would meet with stakeholders. We will have open community engagement opportunities to really understand what are the local planning issues we're dealing with and how can we best help them develop possible solutions. We have a lot of very intensive work sessions. There are 2 days that are booked morning to night. And before the workshop, though, there is a long pre-planning phase, which we are actually starting right now with our 2024 community. This is where we select a group of volunteers, we engage with the community, we work with them to define project goals and desired outcomes. We collect base data and get familiar with all the information so we can be the most efficient when we are there doing the 2-day workshop. After the workshop, we reconvene and we further develop ideas. Initial ideas usually come out during the workshop. We prepare initial recommendations, and then that goes into a final report or ideas book where we make sure we consolidate all these recommendations, all the work that has been done, and we put a lot of emphasis on implementation strategies and making sure we help the community with things that some of them at least could be easily implementable. During these last 3 years, we have worked with a diversity of communities across the country. They all have very unique demographics. Some are very rural and with very small populations. Other ones are much more urban with larger populations. But most importantly, each one of them has a very specific issue where they have not had in-house resources to address it. During the first D-PRAT, we worked with the town of Center in Colorado, and the goal there was to help the town brainstorm some options for downtown revitalization, and also to outline a conceptual master plan for a 90-acre property that the town had just acquired, and they were envisioning as an opportunity for future affordable housing and some other housing typologies. In year 2, we work with the city of Milan in Missouri to help enforce the historical importance of the community by providing information and guidance on the value of historic preservation and adaptive reuse. And we also focus on reimagining some of their key public spaces and corridors. And finally, last year, D-PRAT supported the North Miami community in Florida, focusing on climate change and resiliency related issues from a perspective of interventions in the public realm. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris to talk a little bit more about our partnerships in each one of these projects.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne, for that overview. I think one of the things that we recognize as we've developed these each year is that it's really important to have folks on the ground who are regional partners, because oftentimes they can help sort of set the stage, help us understand what the dynamics are, and provide incredibly valuable information, because you remember, we're only going in for a couple of days. So the more we can establish those relationships on the front end, the stronger our understanding of what the issues are and what the opportunities, particularly when we went down to South Florida, because you're seeing climate change in real time there. And it really had an impact on the entire team. And it really changed maybe some of the thoughts that we initially had. The other important thing about this partnership is once we're done, if they've been invested in this process, they're now invested with this community, and they can help carry on some of the initial ideas and becoming incredibly important partners carrying forward. Next slide. And then as you drill down, okay, now we're on site. Who are the kind of people that we engage with? So obviously we want to talk to the city officials, their key staff, their department heads. We want to meet with those regional agency staff. And then it's important, as we all know, working in particularly small communities, how important the politics are of the situation, because oftentimes, like in Crystal's situation, she's the town administrator. So they don't have a mayor, she's the top official there. But you're never going to get some of these implementations done unless you have that political support. We always have local advocates, whether it's environmental, historic preservation, and these are the people, as we all know, that are passionate about, and gathering their passions and collecting that really sets the foundation. A lot of times, talking to the financial institutions is very important to understand where, because oftentimes they're can be the biggest contributors. They oftentimes own property downtown, so they become important partners. Developers, obviously, because they're the ones who are leading that change. Preservationists, property owners, school officials. And we want to talk a little bit in greater detail about our engagement with youth. So we start to learn what's going on. We have our site tours. And then all at the same time with our volunteers, we're developing both a ground team, and the selection of that is people that have certain expertise that can sort of focus on those target areas that Marianne was identifying, whether it's preservation or transportation, urban design, or architecture. We're also concurrently establishing a virtual team. And we're inviting everybody who is a member of the UDP to volunteer. We only have a few slots for the ground team, but at this time we have no limit on the virtual team, and that's the beauty of that. So we'll talk a little bit more about their role later. And then, as I mentioned, the partner, and what was great in North Miami is that we had several planners who lived in the area. So we were able actually to accommodate them for an overnight. It really was, and they also brought all that local knowledge. So they were able to be part of the ground team. That's where we were able to expand. And finally, I cannot say enough about the importance of the student scholar. Both, I think they get a lot of experience, but they're really the sort of that keeps the whole group together. They keep the administration of who's joining on this team, a lot of the logistics, and then on the ground, they're there at the workshop, really being that that person that takes care of all the little details. Next slide. So just to point out, we've become a nation of volunteers, a small nation, but we want to grow that. And I just want to recognize some of you maybe on the call today. We really appreciate all the volunteer work, and hopefully, I know we've gained a lot from the division's perspective. The communities will hear about what they've gained, but hopefully we've gained something from each other, just making these new connections. And then also just that sort of that networking opportunity. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier, I wanted to talk a little bit about the engagement piece. Everybody has done the DOT exercises and the visual preference surveys. The way that we tackled this with both in Milan and North Miami was we had talked to Crystal, we had talked to Christina, and we sort of, here are the big issues. And by doing it, we're bringing precedents from areas that are, you don't show palm trees in Minnesota, but you certainly bring in precedents that sort of help us gauge where the community is on the spectrum of outdoor cafes and pop-up parks and things of that nature. And then they start to tell us, so what one of our volunteers did is they tallied those dots afterwards, and you see the charts down below. So then that establishes the priorities, but then that becomes our working. So when we go to the next phase, when we're actually looking at, okay, where are we going to focus our attention? we look to these priorities so that we can go back to the community and say, hey, we took your top 3 ideas and here's what they look like. Next slide. And so, you know, having those stakeholder interviews early on in the workshop and kind of, we had almost a fight break out in North Miami because one of the council members came in, he's like, oh, those people over there, you know, they're the biggest thorn in my side. And we talked to those people, and then we talked to him, and we actually, by the end of the workshop, they were talking to each other. And sure, they don't love each other, but at least they're having that dialogue and they understand where each other stands. So we oftentimes serve as facilitators. Towards the end of the workshop, we actually show them some of our initial ideas, and we get some reaction to that and say, okay, we like where this is going. And this is pretty important too for some of the elected officials and sort of department heads. It's like, hey, are you okay if we sort of run with this bike idea, this network plan, and what are the things that we need to know about? So that engagement sort of at the end of the workshop is also gives us a little bit of you know, sort of the spectrum of where we can focus our energies. Now I want to talk a little bit about the youth. We have a professor from Fresno State, Keith Woodcock, who wanted to volunteer, and he says, I want to try something. I've been working with a lot of youth. He's a professor, but is really focused on engaging how we sort of have that conversation about the future. So in North Miami, it took him 3 days, but he finally got in there to talk through. And he was able to have a conversation with these students, and he did a mapping exercise. And it's kind of hard to read, but the students really focused on the area around the high school. And they identified using a series of colors and dots where they felt threatened or concerned and where they felt safe. Where are the areas that they thought there were opportunities? So they're really, one, they're being heard, and 2, they give us some of the best information. Next slide. I also want to mention that Keith also teaches at Cal Poly, one of the great schools in the California system. When we went to Milan, much different place than North Miami, these kids don't have a lot of other resources. They're far away from any other sort of activities. So what we did here was we did a mapping exercise that we also looked at the same question. And you can see how engaged they were. So Keith met with them, and next slide. They produced a map, and it's hard to see, but there are 3 colors. There's the blue. These are places that they really feel, or blue sort of those good places. The red are places that they felt uncertain or fearful. And then the yellow were places that they liked, and you know, but there were some improvements that could be measured there. So as you see in the diagram, the map there, a lot of mixed feelings about the high school. It's a very old high school, but it's also their home for many hours of the day. So the high school has opened up the parking lot actually to allow the kids to hang out there, because one of the other favorite places is the courthouse square. However, it's not really, they get oftentimes run off by property owners, shop owners, the police. You know, they just don't always feel comfortable. Yet instinctively, that is a town's place to gather, and is in the town square where everyone feels welcome. And if you look, we sort of tallied up where the various elements were. And this also helped tell the story to the local leadership that the youth have spoken. And it helps them hear things, because as we know, sometimes we're not really paying much attention to some of the young people in their perspective. But this was a way for us doing it. Next slide. So the other thing that Keith did was he took it one step further, and he introduced this photo voice project. And it's a great outreach tool. And they were focused, probably for the first time in their lives, what do you think of your hometown, and what would you do to improve it? So each one of them wrote a story about, you know, this one up here was talking about the subway that used to be there and how it was sort of a gathering place. They remember things, and they remember what was. And a lot of times they want to sort of reintroduce those. So each one of them did a poster and told a story, and each of those stories is shared in the D-PRAT Milan. I was just so profoundly touched It's like the plan almost writes itself if you just listen. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it back over to Mary Ann to sort of introduce the Mylan project, and then we'll take it from there. Mary Ann.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and like we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you joined a little bit later, Crystal Bubb, which is the city administrator for the city of Milan, felt pretty sick this morning, so was not able to join us. This is her slide deck. So between me and Chris, we're going to try to do the best to walk you through these and tell you a little bit about the story of Milan in Missouri, which was our 2022 D-PRAT community. So Milan is the county seat for Sullivan County on the kind of northern part of the state, and the population has remained relatively steady at approximately 2,000 people over the past century. It's a small rural community. Oops, sorry. It's a small rural community. It's a center for agriculture, basically. Also some industry, and 90% of the county's jobs are from those industries that you can see here in the screen. As for demographics, it's a pretty diverse community. Almost 40% of the community is Hispanic or Latino. The median household income is below the state's average, and you can see it's also a relatively young community. In the case of Milan, and I want to tie this back to the idea of the partnerships and how important these are, and they have been for us in this learning process of deploying the D-PRAT program. In the case of Milan, they were made aware of D-PRAT and this opportunity for us to assist with specific issues through the Missouri Main Street program that they had been working with for, I think it was less than a year when we joined, but they already had that partnership in place. We actually worked with two people from Missouri Main Street that were great contributors to the conversation when we had the in-person workshop there. And they really provide us with so much valuable knowledge about the city and about implementation, and what they were looking at and how could we support. So it really came, the project in Milan came from this partnership with Missouri Main Street. And one thing before we go into the specific project goals for Milan is, during these 3 years that we have been doing the D-PRAT program, we call them our test years. Now we're kind of in our first official year where we feel we have refined the program enough and we have understand it well enough that we can say, okay, this is how it's going to look from now on forward. But we learned a lot that having these partnerships is really important. When we come to work with a community like the town of Center in Colorado, and Downtown Colorado Inc. was already working with them in imagining strategies to revitalize their downtown and bringing different housing options. It's such an important thing that helps us advance those ideas and kind of build off from that. So it's something we've really been working on, and we did it with Center, we did it with Milan. We had awesome partnerships that we're going to touch on a little bit later when we talk about North Miami, but working with Miami-Dade, the county's Office of Resiliency, and working with their historic preservation team was very, very valuable for the project. So to tell you a little bit about what we did in the city of Milan, there were 3 major areas that were identified as projects or areas we would explore and help come up with some recommendations. So the first one is a concern when it comes to improving overall building conditions throughout the downtown, and kind of understanding the concept of preserving historic buildings versus having access to means to carry out rehabilitation work. So providing necessarily guidelines and sources for technical assistance was one of the main project goals in this case. And we also looked at strategies on how we could utilize many of the vacant upper level of existing buildings in the downtown for potential housing infill. A second area that was identified with the community, with local leadership and the D-PRAT team was the 3rd Street corridor and the streets that surround the immediate downtown. Milan has a unique terrain, which is kind of hilly. And so the 3rd Street is the primary east-west route connecting downtown Milan with another kind of commercial district, which is the Pearl Street corridor. And so we looked at how this street could be improved from a perspective of streetscape design, but also functionality and bike lanes and connectivity and mobility in general. And then the third major thing that we looked at was the community was really lacking active and usable public spaces. And they thought that they would really benefit from having more gathering spaces, kind of tying this back up to the idea of the youth engagement and how they felt they had no place to gather. And so how could we find opportunities in maybe vacant lands or city-owned properties to provide some ideas of how places could be retrofitted and become like a more active and usable public space. So this map just shows kind of the 3 project areas. Number 1, you can see it's kind of the downtown square. Number 2 is the corridor we were talking about. And then the big red square is the downtown core that we looked up. And then the 2 orange squares are we identified 2 parcels that could be acquired by the city or could be redesigned by the city to serve as public spaces and gathering places. We just have a couple of slides to go a little bit more in depth with these specific projects, just so you have an idea of what we did in this case. And one thing about D-PRAT is, I got a question the other day, it's like, well, you guys always do the same type of projects. No, the projects really change and vary with each community. So they can really range a lot from what we're doing year to year. We try to stay within the areas of urban design planning and historic preservation. But within that, in some years, it has been really mobility focused. So we had volunteers that were experts in that realm. Last year, it was really on climate change and sustainability. So we focus a lot on that. So every year, the projects are different, and we try to bring experts and the expertise that is the best for those type of projects. So for historic preservation, one thing, we did a recommendation to register the downtown area with the National Register, and we defined a boundary from them. We gave them some strategies for more partnerships that could help them implement this in the short term, and also finding historic preservation grants for funding and rehabilitation in the downtown area. The other group, looking about 3rd Street and mobility, we looked at larger connectivity and bike network that would connect with a future reservoir that is just going to be built north of the town, and the impact that could have in kind of economic revitalization and bringing people through the town once this reservoir is built. And how could we approach this? What were opportunities from the perspective of connectivity and mobility? And one of the ideas was using some abandoned rail lines on an area by the train depot that we think could be an important connection, but also looking at 3rd Street itself and the corridor and how this right-of-way could be reimagined to incorporate bike lanes and be more pedestrian friendly and be a more walkable corridor that connects the city east through west. So with that, I'm going to hand it back here to Chris to talk about the other project area.
So as I mentioned earlier, each one of the ground team then sort of takes on one of these themes. And the particular group that I was involved with was focused on the public square activation and pedestrian safety. As you recall, the students had told us this, the community told us this, that, and I'll tell you that Milan is like an urban designer's dream, because it is this beautiful classical courthouse square that's been there over 100 years. It's surrounded and it's intact around the edges. So it's a real diamond in the rough. One of the challenges is from the curb to curb is 65 feet. So there's a lot of asphalt out there. And if you look back at historical pictures over time, they kept, taking away from the town square. So that town lawn, that courthouse square kept getting smaller and smaller as these bigger vehicles in this back end and head end parking started to evolve. So one of the first things that Christina and the others, it's like, what can we do without spending a lot of money to both activate and make it safer? So as you can see in the plan, we're doing some bulb outs, some mid-block crossings, and then in the lower right of the plan, there was an existing amphitheater that was rather unused, rather cold. So one of the students, or one of the volunteers who actually happened to be from Washington, D.C., and he's like, I want to do tactical urbanism. I'm like, maybe we shouldn't call it tactical urbanism, because that, you're in Milan, Missouri, and people sort of associate things with terminology. So, but we talked about reactivating this amphitheater, and you did these great drawings, very simple, adding lights, creating a little buffer next to that really wide street. And then he also sort of took the existing, Butler building of a pavilion and turned that into something much nicer, took the blank wall. So that was just an example of a couple of the projects. Next slide. And out of this came a number of goals. So each one of the volunteers that was on my team then took one of these goals and then did a plan. So area one was this existing community park that all it had was a picnic shelter. So she took that, and I believe Margarita is on the call. So thank you, Margarita. And she did a design for that. And she took from that list of the things that the community and the students were saying and put that into her design. Another participant took the idea of creating that vacant lot and turning it into a community garden. But he did it in phases so that as the opportunity and interest grows, it's a low-cost measure. So these became the goals that then became the projects that we worked on through after the site visit. Next slide. And ultimately, this came into the form of the report. So we are giving them a deliverable that looks at both immediate, short, and long-term opportunities and try and create that roadmap for them. Next slide. So since we've been there, Crystal has been busy, and she's gotten some enhancement grants. So we wanted to take you through some of the progress, some of the things that she's working on that we think is really important to the implementation. As I mentioned earlier, really wide street, no crosswalks, lots of big vehicles. This is farm country, and people come in, and they just sort of take over that space. Back in the 70s, they wrapped the entire downtown with these wooden awnings. So Crystal's been at work. So next slide. So she's been working with some grants and local architecture, and has already, just visually, you can see how much this transformed. And you can imagine the ripple effect of some gesture like this in terms of occupancy, more interest, more investment. So sometimes these streetscape improvements can go a long way, sort of uncover the beauty and help people recognize that there's so much potential there. Next slide. And then, of course, there's some pretty straightforward but little meaningful things to the occupants. So they were able to secure some facade grants, and in this case, starting to dismantle one of those awnings or one of those canopies. And this was a later one, a metal one, but then reintroducing and looking back at that original storefront and bringing back an awning. Next slide. And then in this particular block face, you see that very prominent sort of wooden arcade and a rather sort of straightforward rendering of the brick, just all painted red, or the original brick. And the cars parked in front. There's no relief. There's no sort of pop-up spaces. Next slide. So what they're envisioning is, over time, taking the awning down and then reintroducing more of a traditional Main Street look with a variety of facade colors. And then you couple that with the pedestrian improvements, and you're really starting to very easily and without a whole lot of expense, transform the city. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christina. Christina Viala is, as she mentioned earlier, formerly with North Miami, and she was the applicant. And the interesting thing about this process is that there's a reason that she wrote that application, and she's looking for help and answers. But being urban designers and being creative people, we can't help when we go into a community and we want to experiment. We see opportunities. And also, this is sort of an opportunity for us, as I said earlier, to do things that we don't normally do in our day-to-day job. So we worked with Christina to focus on her ideas and her needs, but we also wanted to give our volunteers an opportunity to have some fun. So she's going to talk about North Miami, and then we'll get into the last part of our discussion. Thank you.
Hi, I think my camera is acting up, but as long as you can see me, hear me, that's the most important thing. So I am the former sustainability administrator for the city of North Miami. And yes, you can go to the next slide, Mary Ann. And initially I applied to this project because it was an opportunity to kind of be very creative with our sustainability issues and get some urban design recommendation as well. So North Miami, we are a municipality in Miami-Dade County, Florida, and we are fighting climate change. We're dealing with a lot of flooding, but at the same time, especially after the pandemic, we are feeling a lot of pressure for redevelopment. Everybody wants to live in South Florida now. So we're trying to balance growth with preservation, with climate change. So it is in that spirit that we applied to the D-PRAT program. Next slide. So a very important part of this study was analyzing existing conditions. And overall here, you can see some of the improvements that we're kind of going to tackle along this. And we'll talk about it more, how we divided this study into 3 groups. Here you can see the mobility section of the group and some of the improvements. And if you go to the next slide, Mary Ann. We also have some urban design and preservation, historic preservation recommendations that we'll get into in this group. Next slide. So a little bit about North Miami. We were originally the land of the Tequesta people, and then we evolved into a small farming community. And now in a municipality in Miami-Dade County, we're very diverse. We have a very large Haitian population in our city. We are strategically located between 2 major international airports, Miami-Dade, MIA, and Fort Lauderdale. We have lots of wonderful landmarks, such as the Biscayne Bay campus of Florida International University, our Museum of Contemporary Art, and Oleta River State Park, which is Florida's largest urban park. Next slide. So I spoke about this a little earlier, but it's in the context of fighting with flooding, climate change, storm surge and king tide that we applied. And when we applied for this as well, we wanted to introduce low impact developments and bicycle planning into this project, and we got a chance to tackle a lot of different problems at the same time through the D-PRAT program. Next slide. And while doing this project with D-PRAT, some of our goals also included to enhance the relationships that we have between city staff, residents, and stakeholders. Chris kind of mentioned some of the spats that happened during our charrette. So this was a great opportunity to mend some of the bonds between our staff. We're a small city. A lot of employees wear a lot of different hats. So this was an opportunity for us to connect and to, come up with very innovative solutions. And this was also an opportunity for us to cultivate our bond with the county and different APA members from different cities throughout South Florida. This was lastly a way for us to forge our identity as a North Miami residents. Next slide. So through this project, we went through our comprehensive plan, and a lot of solutions were actually in our comprehensive plan. So this was a really great review of what we already had. This was a good visualization of these items. And we introduced green street initiatives. Especially, we were very focused on bioswales and rain gardens and active modes of transportation like bicycle planning, and just really creating, again, the sense of community pride and identity while we're fighting climate change, heat, humidity, etc. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, this project was divided into 3 different groups. So we had, during the 2-day meeting, and even prior to that, we had different planners and designers. And the first group was focused on resiliency, low impact design, and passive parks. North Miami has a series of underutilized parks and open spaces, which really serve as stormwater management spaces in the city. So they have no amenities. So this was a really great opportunity to reimagine some of these spaces and have them be vehicles for fighting climate change by introducing native plantings throughout the city. So this study really will focus on these 4 areas: Oleander Park and the green spaces on northeast, on both sides of a pedestrian bridge on Northeast 131st Street, some of these passive parks that I mentioned previously, and our wonderful stormwater park that we have, which is award-winning but could use a little bit of enhancement. Next slide. So the first park that you see here is Oleander Park. So these parks are more like stormwater amenity parks, or for utilities. So these parks, they don't really have any function in the city aside from being for stormwater amenities. They are fenced in, so they prevent a lot of our residents from enjoying them. And if you go to the next slide, and Chris, feel free to add to this, we propose a lot of improvements to our passive parks, such as Oleander Park and this passive park on Northeast 130th and 5th Avenue. So some of the improvements would be to add bioswales and rain gardens and remove fencing. And so basically we'd be creating a lot more urban stormwater parks in our city. We do have one right now, the Good Neighbor Stormwater Park. So we would have a series of stormwater parks to make our community more resilient.
Yeah, and I might add, Christina, that one of the things that we learned from our friends at Office of Resiliency was that when you see flooding in South Florida, it's not coming necessarily from the ocean, it's coming from below. And what has happened is the water table has risen up so much that anytime there's almost any rain, it doesn't have to be 100-year rain, it's any good cloudburst. The water table is so high that water just immediately starts to pond. The other problem is that in many cases there's not a curb and gutter type of infrastructure. It's usually just a swale, as she mentioned earlier. Of course, what do people do? They park on that swale. This is all, in that area next to it. The swale sort of fills in, and next thing you have compacted sand, which is virtually impervious as well. So a lot of the focus was really using fairly well-known techniques, but then demarcating where the car can park and where we want to reinvest. And then we need to help people they have a free tree program there. There's a lot of vegetation. One of the things that we learned was, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, was we didn't realize that there was sort of some opposition to native plantings and native trees, that they sort of like a glossier version. So I'm going to talk to Christina a little bit about that later, but what some of the resistance was. But in this particular case, we took one of the passive spaces, and just so everybody knows, each one of these pages was either created by one of our volunteers or one of the ground people, or a combination of both. So each page was sort of put together, and then Andrea, our wonderful scholar, put this booklet together and cleaned it up. But this is all original work from each one of the participants. Christina, you want to keep going, or?
Yeah, sure. We can bounce off each other. Marianne, you can go to the next slide. Oh, and I want to add, in some areas of the city, you can actually see where the water table is. So it's literally right below your feet. But on average, South Florida, it's about 6 feet below ground, the water table. So the second group was mobility. And some of the outcomes of this group was creating potential corridors in the city. For instance, 131st Street, creating an east-west corridor, and then also a north-south corridor throughout the city. So you can go to the next slide. And the wonderful thing about this, we're improving the future bicycle network, but at the same time, we're adding low impact development items to it. So we're proposing swale improvements. So mobility and greenscapes they're working together throughout the city.
And this was an area too where the input from the community about where the destinations were and where were they having struggle to get to, and then identifying, David Goodman, one of the group leaders, I believe, is on the call. His group, they identified the 131st Street corridor, which was not necessarily on our radar going in, but it was the only east-west corridor that went under 95. And as you can see in the image on the left, that's 8 lanes. And that has divided North Miami east and west, and we all have seen what that kind of can do to a neighborhood. Very few crossings under 95. So one of the big ideas was to create this bicycle boulevard that can get you to the places like the high school, like the commercial areas. Also, there's a commercial area on the east side and the west side. And this became an opportunity, as Christina was saying, to incorporate both Green Street best practices, but also given that the streets are fairly wide, we were able to recapture enough room for a bike lane or a share type situation where people yield, sort of a yield street. And of course, what that does is it slows everybody down. It gives bicycles a place to be, and they feel that it reduces their stress. It creates some separation between that and the pedestrian. And yet we're also able to reclaim these swales because this is where people were sort of parking. So it all becomes an orchestration of taking what's there. And in this example here, some of these had some very nice mature canopy trees. So you don't want to necessarily turn those into rain gardens, but you can selectively create places. And then we noticed that there wasn't a huge parking demand. So let's take back some of those parking areas and be very clear about where you can park. And so these street sections really start to give the city an idea of what a complete street can be. So on to our last group. Group 3 was focused on infill development and preservation. This was one of those areas where, because we're the Urban Design and Preservation Division, we can't help but look for opportunities to help reinvigorate the commercial areas, the historic areas. So while Christina was, the sustainability director, we felt like, hey, here's an opportunity for us to maybe help the city see some things from our perspective, knowing what we know about how development takes place and what pressures it can put and what opportunities it could present. So we established some goals around, first of all, helping people recognize what a large number of historic resources they have, helping to realize that those sidewalks that are sort of given way to parking can be recaptured. and then looking at some infill development opportunities, but also looking at some things that, in terms of that development pressure that Christina mentioned earlier, what are the things that we could illustrate to help them understand what could be coming? Next slide.
And Chris, if I might jump in here, one thing I wanted to highlight is that many times, because we are the Urban Design and Historic Preservation Division, we're thinking, okay, how can we bring these two disciplines together? That a lot of times we don't feel like we collaborate enough. And in the case of North Miami, we were working, like I said, with Miami-Dade Office of Resiliency, which they have done great studies for the county and having initiatives and strategies for flood and sea level rise. So we were understanding the impact that that piece has on the city and how it will limit areas of future growth and redevelopment, because a lot of it is in areas of flood or where the ocean rise could affect them. And then again, working with Miami-Dade Office of Historic Preservation, they were such a great partner and help us understand how some ideas for infill or redevelopment and existing downtown or urban areas could be solutions to deal with growth when you have a limited amount of space to do so. So just kind of reiterating this concept that how everyone worked together and came together to think about these issues made us see a different perspective that maybe we would have not seen otherwise.
Thank you, Marianne. I think that's such an important perspective. So please chime in at any point. As I said earlier, each one of these were project pages, and project one was really first documenting. So we worked very closely with the Office of Preservation, and they were very, very helpful because they see us as a way to sort of open up opportunities for them to get a time in front. And we're sort of taking their objectives and illustrate them and putting them forward so that more people could see them. Another area, and this was one that we struggled with, that I ended up doing this, was we had a really wide street that had got wider and wider over the years. So what had been parking lots in front of these strip retail businesses had essentially become drive aisles over time. But when we went there, we saw that those areas were so full of life, so full of local businesses and entrepreneurial, and sort of, it had that funky feeling that is not something you can choreograph through a developer. So we're like, well, how do we make this work? Because it's a complete mess. There are cars everywhere, and it's just not safe. And they're actually using the driveway entrances as part of their circulation. So it became, it's untenable in the future. But we also don't want to blow it all up. So the idea was to encourage the reuse of these spaces as outdoor cafes, as pop-up space, that then they would not, the tool is we don't require any parking. There is on-street parking on this big boulevard, but it's so fast, so high speed that people don't use it. But if we can slow that down, put some more signage, make it more parking friendly, then we also are starting to create a buffer against that, the activity. And then these spaces can be repurposed by the business owners for eateries, pop-up spaces, and so forth, and really bring that livelihood. But it's also a huge economic benefit because now they're adding more seats, and it's starting to feel that cultural vibe. A large Haitian community here, and this is really where their culture sort of comes out, is the activities that you see in this area. So this was really a challenge, and I think we all face it in our cities, is what do we do with these strip centers that just aren't well, they can't be parked, they create a lot of curb cuts on our highways. So this was one solution. And then we talked about, the downtown. So in this case, there was an existing post office building, and we heard while we were down that there were plans for redevelopment of the site. And of course, it was going to be completely wiped out and start fresh. And Jeff Schumacher, our ground team leader, did a wonderful job of demonstrating how you can do carefully placed infill that you're building on. This is where Dixie Highway comes through 125th. So this is their historic area. And once again, really narrow sidewalks, and very few street trees, with some not too bad buildings. And there was this part of Dixie Highway that had been cut off for traffic purposes, but it still had a lot of great resources around it. So Jeff took that idea and made more of a pedestrian destination on the upper image on the right. And then he showed how that the post office building could be redeveloped and how other selective infill could rebuild this downtown core and take that development energy and put it into something meaningful and qualitative versus just trying to max out the yield. Next slide. One of the things too that we discovered is that their zoning ordinance on the east side of 95 allows buildings to go up to 200 feet. So I drew a section of what's there today, and then I drew a section of what zoning will allow, because I don't think anybody has any idea what's coming. And when we talk to some folks, they're like, let's go, let's build, let's build. And I'm thinking, well, what about that character of that 7th Avenue and those small businesses? And oh, by the way, we have some single family neighborhoods on both sides. So recognizing that, we started talking about tapering on and doing some selective preservation on the west side of 7th Avenue, and then letting that economic development and the energy flourish near 95, because then that actually creates a nice sound barrier, and then they sort of take advantage of both. But we also introduced the idea of these urban design guidelines, so when that new development comes, it still maintains a more of a pedestrian scale, and stepping back and keeping that light and air, and of course also investing through that development and walkable streetscapes, bike lanes, and transit. Marianne?
Yes,
Did you have
so, Chris, no, I think this is our last slide for North Miami. So I don't know if Christina wanted to add anything before we wrap up this part of the presentation, before we move ahead and introduce our new community for 2024, and then jump into Q&A with all of you.
No, I just would like to add that this was probably North Miami's first attempt at historic preservation. We had a beautiful colonial revival city hall, which was torn down. And there are plans, of course, for more development for the existing city hall. But through this, we've discovered that we could actually be tearing down something that should be preserved, a brutalist architecture that's very important to South Florida. So urban, and then we also discovered a lot of grassroots historic preservation that is ongoing in North Miami. So I just wanted to add that, and we're extremely grateful for the involvement that we have from Miami-Dade County, their Office of Historic Preservation, and Office of Resilience.
Okay, well, with that, we would like to introduce our 2024 D-PRAT community. That is going to be the town of Enfield, Connecticut, and specifically we're going to be working in the Thompsonville area. We had a very competitive group of communities that applied this year. We really would love to work with all of them, to be honest, but we have to choose one. So we have Aaron Markovich here, which is the Director of Economic and Community Development for the town of Enfield. So Aaron, if you want to say a couple of things about your community.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really exciting thing for us to be part of this D-PRAT process and use the opportunities. Just as I give folks a sense, Enfield sits right on the Massachusetts-Connecticut border, right on Interstate 91, about halfway between Springfield and Hartford, very near to Bradley International Airport. So we're sort of at a crossroads. We kind of talked about the fact that Enfield sits at a crossroads. It's a community that, if you don't really know the New England style of operation, there tends to be a large town area. Enfield is the large town, and then villages within that. So Thompsonville is a village within the larger town of Enfield. And remainder of Enfield is a mix of 20th century sort of car-centered development. We have plenty of agriculture, including a kind of unique micro environment of tobacco growing. We have kind of an interesting mix, but as I mentioned, Thompsonville sits right at the point. It's sort of at the very far end of that picture of the Connecticut River. It sits right on the Connecticut River, where the freshwater brook comes into the river. And in 1829, Orrin Thompson established his first carpet mill, which would then go through various gyrations and growth, becoming eventually Bigelow Hartford. This was a major carpet manufacturing operation for all of the United States. The Bigelow carpets were well known and put in very important locations around the United States. It was in many ways the beating heart of Enfield as a manufacturing center, an access point across the Connecticut River. The main bridge across the river was located right in downtown until it was taken down in the 70s and moved south out of the center of town. And of course, in the 1970s, the carpet mill shut down as well. And that really changed the environment of Thompsonville. It has continued to kind of struggle to regain that importance. We've had lots of plans that have been developed. I know we have several of our planning staff kind of watching in. We have lots of different plans that have been developed, and it has struggled to kind of catch hold and catch fire and really take off. Now, the thing that has really changed recently has been the planned opening of a train station on the Hartford line that will be a major stop between Springfield, which then would connect to Boston, and New Haven. And that is the main line, of course, into New York City. So this is a massive north-south connection, and Enfield will be on that line again. We also have developers who are coming ahead with plans for housing, waterfront-based housing. We have some funding for Main Street's improvements and placemaking. And we're looking for a project that will really lean on some of those visualizations that you all saw. We want to kind of really see Thompsonville and use that as a marketing opportunity, a way that we can sell Thompsonville as a place for people to come and establish their businesses and establish their homes and everything. We want to really look at the Connecticut River waterfront and what we can do with making that waterfront more accessible. It is a fantastic location to throw a kayak in the river and kind of paddle around. Going north on the river is a pretty large span of flat water. Coming south, you can kind of just make it out in this picture of the river. There's an area called Enfield Falls or Enfield Rapids, and creates sort of a bump in the river. But north of that is very much flat and consistent. We have the remains of the old bridge, the piers. How can we use that? How can we make placemaking on Main Street, which I mentioned? How can we activate the freshwater brook corridor as a public amenity? So we have some great pieces there. And we want to make sure that we can visualize it and that we can take these many plans that we have in place and organize them and really make a very actionable, implementable type of program. So we're looking forward to working with planners, architects, landscape architects, economic development folks, preservation folks, a variety of things to help us visualize and consider the next major steps. So I'm happy that if there are folks that have questions about the community, I know there might be questions about the rest of this program, but certainly about Enfield. We're just really excited and looking forward to working with a huge range of volunteers we're nearby in New England, so we'd love to see some of you folks in the New England area. And I think that's probably what I've got. Marianne, did I miss anything?
No, I think that was great. Thanks so much, Aaron. And just as a reminder, if any of you watching the webinar are members of the division and are interested in volunteering, we will have a call for volunteers out in the next week or two. So keep an eye out of that. Or if you're local or live near Enfield, we would love to have you as part of this year's program.
And on that note too, if you're not a member of the division, but you are a member of the APA, you can certainly join. That's what I did. I just joined when I got into this program. And if you're a student, membership is free in the various divisions. So we'd love to have you. And Aaron, thank you. You did a great job recruiting. Hopefully, some folks and if any of you live in that region. Last year, as I mentioned, we were able to open up some opportunities for a greater ground team with some of our planner volunteers because they were within a day, a couple hours driving distance. So if you or someone you know is in that area and interested, we'll be sending out a call for interest here in a couple weeks. So just to wrap things up, what I said earlier is that by integrating the community in this meaningful way, we start to develop, a vision, and that the people, when they start to see this vision start to take shape, they start believing again. And that's why we focus on some of these smaller projects, just to say that all is not lost. Some things are possible. And in that barn raising spirit, perhaps some of these things that you can take on as an individual. And so those relationships are really key. And then, like in North Miami, there is at a regional level, there's this big focus on climate change, but that wasn't necessarily reaching the people who are directly impacted by that. And then I think as urban designers, as planners, looking at the big picture, we see that there's this important relationship to reinforce, and that it's really critical that people appreciate the past, and from an embodied energy and sustainability standpoint, we can engage that. So if you are interested, if you've got local universities or places where that might be in that area that might be interested in participating, we'd love to hear from you. Next slide. So here are some things that we learned. As we mentioned, this process gets people together in the same room talking. And as I mentioned about the city council person and the advocate, we got them talking. And I think for the first time, maybe, and the developer was there too, and she was talking to him as well. And he understood that, you can't just lay down your 8-story building across the street from a 1-story house without acknowledging that. You can't just put your garage back there. And so I think that's one of the things that they realize, is that they do have power, and we're giving them the tools. And I think some of the things I want to talk about here, or we'd like the folks to talk about, is how do we select these communities? One of the things that these are folks that are not members of APA. So how do they find out about this program? So anybody has ideas, put those in the chat. What are other ways that you can think of that we maybe want to talk about that could be more beneficial? For example, we haven't talked about affordable housing. That was a big issue in Milan. But some places, that's sort of taboo. And then I think one of the things that are there other divisions that we could partner with as we go into this? Maybe it's, the fine arts division or the rural division, things of that nature. And then how do we potentially expand that? And so I want to open up the questions, but first I want to pose a couple of questions in our discussion to Marianne and Christina. So I think is that our last slide? It is, okay. So Christina, we were talking about earlier about some of the reluctance that some of the residents had towards this crazy notion called green infrastructure. What do you think the roots of that are? And then how how do we start to overcome that? So, because that was something that you were really concerned about when we first got there, is like people just don't seem to get it, they don't care. So what are some of your thoughts and why that is?
I think in North Miami, just anecdotally thinking about my conversations with developers, residents, even police officers, there's always this fear that what's hiding in green, in behind the bushes. There is this need for visibility, and they feel like these hedges, these bioswales, or it looks too wild, and it's hiding wildlife. And because of that, they're reluctant to having any sort of green infrastructure, and also the maintenance that's required with planting trees. So it doesn't really seem like good, valid responses. But I'm biased. I'm a sustainability administrator. I want green everywhere.
Now, what were some of the problems with what they are planting? These are non-native plants. What are some of the issues around that? Is that around prestige, or is it the cheapest thing you can get at Home Depot? What are some of the issues with the current things that are being planted?
There's not always the native plants are not always planted at the right stage of their life. Also, there's a tendency to plant things when they're a little bigger, but sometimes there might be a valid reason to plant something very small. You don't have to start with an oak that's 10 feet tall, but that's what's in our code, unfortunately. But what you would start something smaller, you would have it grow stronger. So yeah, we're fighting our code, and so there's that bias. But there's also a tendency sometimes to plant things that maybe are invasive. There's this fascination for palm trees, and a lot of these palms are invasives in South Florida landscape.
Okay, great. So we do have some questions. So let's go ahead and have those. Christine, would you like to give us the first question? Thank you.
Sure. And this first question is more specific to D-PRAT. Do you do any international D-PRAT projects? And perhaps there could be a connection with the international division, but that's question number one.
I can take that one on, Christine. We don't, but we would love to. It's something that we have certainly talked about internally and with our volunteers from the last years, and how great it would be to bring an effort like this to communities outside the United States. Like, could we do that? There's so many places that need so much help. Personally, being from Chile, I have seen urban areas with so much poverty that could benefit so much from technical assistance like this, and so many cities around the world. So the question is no, the answer is no, we have not done any, but we're really starting to think about and how we could make something like that sustainable and viable in the future. We're really definitely looking into it.
Yeah, it's
go ahead.
interesting. I just want to say to Marianne that that was the question I was going to ask you, but more on a local basis. Is this replicable? Do we have to is there a way to sort of expand the D-PRAT? So a particular chapter like the Ohio, APA chapter, is this something that we could formulate into more of a program that is, because we don't want to make it, no disservice to ULI, but those are very expensive interventions. We really want to keep this at low cost. So do you think that it's replicable? Is there a model here that we could potentially look at?
Chris, if I can add to what you're saying, I definitely think that the work that was done in North Miami is replicable throughout all South Florida, maybe even a little further up in other southern states and municipalities.
I will say, if you joined us on our webcast last week, the title of that one was it was a community in Florida, and Florida has this same program, but just for APA Florida. So there are opportunities. We could talk about that. But I do want to get into a couple of things specific to these projects. And my first question is if we could explore a little further, once you go in and you do this work for this community, and then you say, okay, we got to go now, goodbye. What are the follow-ups? Is there follow-up? How do we ensure, like, do you leave them with actionable items, or is it just something, again, that's on the shelf? Do you follow up? Do they need follow-up assistance? If and Christina, if you have thoughts on that and you want to start there, or Chris.
Yeah, I can start. So the first thing we did at the conclusion of this is we had the D-PRAT team present to the Planning Commission in our city. So this was a way to accept this in front of our board. And there was so much enthusiasm for a lot of the proposed designs. One of them was, for example, an improvement under the highway overpass on 131st Street. One of the council members, he insisted so the improvement insisted of lighting and a basketball court underneath and murals. And the councilman, he was like, "This is it. I want you to do this." So there is a lot of enthusiasm. Of course, I've transitioned into another city, but I'm still local and bothering them every once in a while. So yeah, I'll keep you guys posted on North Miami.
Christina, I was going to add to that, and Chris, you can jump in. One of the things we have discussed a lot as part of this D-PRAT project and kind of learning lessons and kind of adjusting the program is we want to make sure we leave something that is not in the shelf, like you said. That's definitely not what we want. All our volunteers are people putting in their time pro bono for something that is just going to be forgotten. So we have talked a lot about how we can focus on recommendations that are easily implementable, kind of low-hanging fruit for the communities. We will always have some kind of higher level recommendations too as part of the process because we can't help it, but we always try to make sure we have recommendations that they could be implemented in the next year, like the facade grant program that Mylan is working on, or the grants they're pursuing to do kind of tactical, easy interventions on some of their streets. We have been following up with both communities, asking them, has this been helpful? What do you suggest we can do differently? We are in that process of learning, and we really want to hear from them. And that's what we have been in touch with Mylan and North Miami, and we will continue to be in touch because we want to make sure, again, what we do is something that is helpful for them. And then the last point I was going to say is those goals that Chris showed earlier in the presentation, we make sure that each one of those is tied to an implementation strategy as part of our recommendation. So in the case of North Miami, some of those kind of more tactical temporary interventions we were showing in some renderings under the underpass. We know that the Florida Department of Transportation has specific grants for underpass improvements that we make sure that's a recommendation. So we try to give them as many tools and ideas as we can as far as future partnerships once we leave and how they can follow up and make this a reality.
This next question is for you, Erin. Since you're kind of hot off the presses, how is the community reacting to this project, this program coming to you?
So looking at our questions over there and formulating answers before you even ask them. So yeah. I had a couple of thoughts that floated through there. First, there was somebody who asked about any active or recent planning, and we have several of those. We have a transit-oriented development plan. We have several different kinds of things that the group will be building on. So that's going to be very good. Whenever I first read the question, it said, how is the community reacting? I was thinking of the projects like the train station or the housing project. And I think the thing about Thompsonville, and this will apply to this program in general, is that there is sometimes a level of resignation. Things just haven't been able to move ahead. And there's a lot, if you know New Englanders, they'll believe it when they see it. So there is very much a case of whenever we see a shovel, when we start to see construction, maybe then we'll feel differently about it. The question also included, is there a fear of prioritizing new residents rather than current residents? I think that is definitely going to be an element of consideration in this. We have some very long-time residents in the community in this area, but it is also very renter heavy as well. So it can be transient in some ways. So there's a lot of different aspects. The census tract for Thompsonville is a designated area for low income, and is going to require some thinking about that. So those were big pieces, but there's plenty of plans, plenty of things to build from a baseline and move ahead.
A question about how this works. Is there a lot of background? And this is for, I guess, maybe Chris, you could start with this, or Christine, any of you really. Do the volunteers that are doing this work, do they do a lot of the background work ahead of time and then, come in for a couple of days, just to kind of see the people, see the places, and then that's it? Or does everything really just happen in those few days? Like, how much other time is spent?
Yeah, great question. And I started to answer that in the chat, but the budget is $6,000. So let's just get that record straight. This is a very low budget operation, and that pays for our ground team, travel and lodging. We hope that the city can contribute meeting space, maybe a meal or two, but they're mostly working with the student scholar and the virtual team. We start to talk about what Aaron is identifying, right? We get on Google Earth, we're like, okay, here are the rough areas that we're going to focus on when we get on the ground. And then when we're on the ground, we'll have at least 1 or 2 calls with the virtual team while we're on site and saying, here's what we're seeing. So we want to keep them involved in the dialogue. We invite them to the presentations and so forth. Afterwards, the 2 days is really about collecting information and documenting. Then we identify the themes, and then each one of those groups with their particular themes, as Christina and I were pointing out, then they tackle that. All of it's done virtually over the next couple of months. So if we have the workshop in late October, hopefully before the holidays, we have a draft plan, and then we spend the last month or so refining that, making sure that it all looks good. So the bulk of the work is actually done after the workshop, and that's where it's important to sort of engage the volunteers, because at that point we're all virtual, and it's really working through, okay, here are the 7 projects that we've identified. Who wants to work on what? And we just divvy it up.
If I can just add, I just want to state how grateful I am to the D-PRAT program. We were so fortunate to have been chosen, and it takes a lot of organization. I had a lot of support from my assistant director at the time, Debbie Love, and the assistant director of public works as well. So once you wrangle all these people together, and the D-PRAT group is ready, you've got a wonderful no-frill process with no procurement. Everybody's in the same room from different municipalities, just focused on North Miami. It was a wonderful opportunity, and congratulations to Enfield. You're in for a wonderful experience.
Hey, thanks, Christina. And I know we are out of time and we have to wrap up. So just a quick reminder that, like Chris said, if you're interested in volunteer, join the Urban Design and Preservation Division. We will have a call out for volunteers, both in person and virtual, in a couple of weeks. It will go out through email blast, through our newsletter, to the webpage, and other divisions' newsletter have posted it too sometimes. So it will be out there through different APA channels. So just keep an eye on that, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Don't forget, we're recording the session, posted up on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/planningwebcast. And you can register for all of our upcoming sessions and get all the information you need at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you for the Urban Design and Preservation Division for hosting today's session. Everyone have a great weekend and we'll talk next time.
Thanks.